Hi everyone, so today's video is going to be another book cover video, of course, because that's all I post on this channel at this point. So today's video I'm going to be making a book cover for my contemporary fantasy novel, Seventh Virtue, and what you're looking at right now is some of the inspiration for the book cover. So I thought it would be really helpful to include what I look at while I design, because I often pull on inspiration from other designers. And so here is just a spread of all of the covers that I looked at. I do have a Pinterest now where I pin some of like my favorite book covers or book covers that are in the vein of what I'm working on. And so I will link it in the description if you're interested. But I was really going for dark colors, textured backgrounds, serif fonts, a cool color palette, embossed text, a strong focal point, and simple design. So you can see the dark colors in book covers such as Six of Crows, From Dusk to Dawn, Sagittarian, The Shadow Between Us, Ninth House, From Blood and Ash. Basically all of them have a pretty dark color palette. Then you have a lot of lights on the other hand, such as in Lore and in Rule of Wolves, and as well as the Court of Miracles. And so I kind of wanted to play with both, but to get a pretty overall moody feel. Something like Rule of Wolves would have been a bit too light, I think, for what I was going for, despite its like really deep, like red burgundy text. So I was keeping that in mind. As for textured background, I really ended up liking what was on the Six of Crows book cover. So there's like watercolor in that. I think the whole thing is watercolor, but particularly that background I really liked. And you'll see in my cover, I actually pull in a watercolor painting for that background in the end. Also, Sagittarian is pretty textured in the background. You see Tarnished Light also has a textured background. And I was really interested in that because I knew I was going to have a bird on it. My book cover is obviously based off of the book, and the idea behind Seventh Virtue is that each virtue is a bird, and because virtues are so central to the book, I knew there was going to be a bird on it, particularly the bird that represents the seventh roost, so basically where the book gets its name from, Seventh Virtue. I also knew that the bird was going to take up a majority of the book cover. I wanted it to be really focused on the bird, such as in Six of Crows. Even in Lore, obviously you're seeing the girl's face, such as even in Ninth House, which I think is probably one of my all-time favorite book covers. If you couldn't tell, I really like whoever designs all of Leigh Bardugo's book covers. A few things to note, obviously, I'm going to be taking into consideration genre. So this book is like urban fantasy. It's also an adult novel, so I tried to keep that in mind. Obviously, a cool color palette would include blues, purples. I didn't really want too much warmth. So those were a few thoughts going in. I actually had zero plan for this book cover. I had no thumbnails. I had no idea. I only knew that there was going to be a bird on the cover. So you're going to get to see me actually come up with concepts on the spot. I really had no idea what I was doing. So let's jump into me making this book cover for Seventh Virtue. So the first thing that I had to do was find this bird, and I actually found a picture of this one a few weeks back, and what I did is I edited it. I added a little bit more blue saturation into the bird, and I put a filter on it to make it look like it was oil paint. And now what I'm doing is I'm making the eye blue. A really important part of the book is that this bird actually has human eyes, and so I actually pulled in an eye and I photoshopped it on top of the bird's because the bird's eye itself wasn't eye-catching enough. No offense, buddy, but I needed something that was a little bit more glowy. So I made sure to dodge and burn the hell out of that, really increase the saturation on it because I wanted it to look eye-catching. Originally, as you can see, I had two birds. I had one on the top and one on the bottom. I ended up changing that, but I thought I would play around with this kind of a composition so that they filled up a majority of the space. So that was a huge part of making this book cover, was just testing things out. And another thing that I tested out a lot was the font. And I really couldn't make up my mind on the font. The hardest part about making book covers, in my opinion, is making decisions. And so I wasn't sure if I wanted to go with this font that had tons of glyphs on it, or this simpler font, or if I wanted to capitalize the first letter to make it look bigger, or if I wanted to capitalize letters on both ends of each word. I really couldn't determine what I wanted, if I wanted the letters to be touching. Really important part, I think, of graphic design is to treat it as your playground. You really are testing things out, and there were several ways this book cover could have gone. I did add a nice like embossing to that lettering because remember that was something that I was really interested in, though this actually changed quite a bit. At one point I had a softer embossing that looked a bit more like a gradient, and I was adding like a blue filter over it, adding some texture as well as some actual like circular gradients to the lettering. letter to add a little bit more color. I found though that when I did too much to the lettering, it made the book cover look a lot more juvenile, and I wanted it to look a little bit stronger, that it could appeal to, older young adults and, people in their early 20s. I didn't want it to look too childlike. I even played around with that like carved look, kind of like how Rule of Wolves looks like it's carved, but nothing was really working out. So I just started hopping between different things. So when I kind of gave up on the font after a little bit, I started playing around with a new composition for the bird, which was just one bird on the cover and it took up more of the space. And I was having a really hard time with this because I wanted it to look like pretty even. If you could see, when the bird was pretty straight, some of the text was cut off. And so I actually used the liquefy tool to like fatten that bird up a little bit. People who know what actual birds look like will probably be like, why did you do that? But I don't really know what actual birds look like, so it didn't look that strange to me. But again, you can let me know if you don't like it. But I ended up keeping that kind of like rounder belly on the bird, and I simplified that lettering on top of it, that it didn't look too eye-catching. Again, with this cover, I was going for bold and I was going for simple, and I think I started overcomplicating it pretty early on, though I will say that I did like this half and half lettering thing. I just found that it was kind of hard to read the title a little zoomed out, though in general this font isn't extremely legible because it is quite thin in some areas, but we have so many battles we can pick from. I also added some feathers. An important thing about these feathers is later on you'll see me, I added some motion blur and also some Gaussian blur to them to make it look like there was some depth of field on the cover. So depth of field is like that nice blurry background you often like, is an increased depth of field. And so that gives a little bit more dimension to the book cover. These are just small things that I'm thinking about as I'm working. Also thinking about what I could put in that background to make it look more like a finished piece rather than just a bird on a white background. And that's when I added in this watercolor painting. It's an actual painting that I found out on Unsplash. I just cropped into like the sky, and I really ended up liking how that looked. I think it added a little bit more grit to the cover that the cover was really lacking. After a while, I did get rid of the half lettering and I just made the whole thing white. And you can see me here adding motion blur to the feathers like I mentioned before. This, I think, is kind of like an underrated kind of part of cover design. Really, depth is a huge thing, looking at how you can play off different textures. So I have many on this cover. I have the grittiness of the paper from the watercolor. I have the feathers of the bird. I have that sleek, smooth, glassy eye. And then I obviously have the feathers that are floating. Keeping in mind texture can add a lot more visual interest. And to add more of that, I did add a bit of like a rim light on this bird. I didn't make it too intense because I still wanted the bird to look quite strong on the page. Then I added a drop shadow to the title, which I think made it pop up a bit more. Something I was playing around with was that red like sort of look. So I was adding it to the text. I was adding some gradients around the book cover, but I didn't end up using those because I wanted to keep the color palette quite limited to just blues, grays, blacks. Really, that's all I was looking for. Later though, toward the end, I did add a little bit of pink, which I ended up liking. I changed the tagline so it was underneath my name. It almost adds like a #1 New York Times bestseller kind of look to it, which I personally like. Not that this book is ever going to be a #1 New York Times bestseller. I really like that look. A little small little details like that tagline can really fill up the space and give the viewer a little bit more to look at on the cover. Really, the end was just playing around with things. I did add like this star like sparkle, and the final thing that I did was add that pink filter on top. I increased the saturation of the blues and of course the reds, and this is the final book cover. I really like how this turned out. I hope that you enjoy it. For now, I will see you guys in another video. Bye!